Hello, hello, everybody. Good evening. We welcome you all to the season finale of Anabaptist World's What Would It Take podcast. This evening we have Dani Klotz, Executive Director of Anabaptist World, and Ben Tapper, host of the podcast. I am Juan Moya, Digital Strategist of Anabaptist World, and we join together in this space to share the stories behind the podcast and how it all came together for this first season. Dani, Ben, welcome to our first live stream with Anabaptist World. Happy to have both of you joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Juan. Good to be here with y'all.
Yeah. So I'm Dani Klotz and the ED of Anabaptist World. I'm super glad to be here with you all and with Juan and Ben. You guys are the rock stars of this podcast, and I'm really grateful that I got to be a partner in the work with you. And this is, I think, the What Would It Take podcast is a good example of really prophetic, important work that I hope Anabaptist World can continue to contribute to our communities and the world, not to be redundant. But Ben, what would you like to share with our viewers about yourself today? And if you wouldn't mind, telling us a little bit about how you got into podcasting and like how that intersects with your faith.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, I'm just excited to be here. This is an event I haven't done before, and so it's really cool. I get excited trying new things, and so I love the vision behind this that Juan and Dani have had. I got into podcasting, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, probably 2 years ago. I was doing an online program for like professional development, and some of the people that were leading the program told me that, you've got kind of cool work. You should think about doing podcasting. I was already kind of doing blogging. I was doing some public speaking. And so I sat on it for a minute and then decided, you know what, I just need to jump into this. So I just kind of went in blind with a podcast called Invisible Truths, which is still technically active. I don't really publish regular content, but it's still out there. And that podcast is just interviews, tons of interviews, me talking to interesting people, kind of exploring what I call these invisible truths within each of us, these things we all wrestle with, the doubts, the questions, the intricacies of life's journey, and just kind of bringing that out so that we could all kind of find the common threads of our humanity. And then I work for a nonprofit here in Indy, and I was able to kind of help them start their own podcast called the Center for Congregations Podcast. And so I got to kind of sharpen my tools with that. And then, I'd been talking with Sheldon, who was the previous director of the previous organization that was not Anabaptist World, right? We kind of bounced the idea of me doing a podcast with that organization around for a minute. And then once Anabaptist World was formed and Dani, you took over, we kind of resumed those dialogues. And so What Would It Take was born.
Yeah. Yeah. And like on the other end of that, this was like our second question and we're getting into it already. But when I came on board for Anabaptist World, right, I was joining this team about like joining these two historical publications. And from the outside, I had like always admired and appreciated the content that the Mennonite was putting out via podcasts. And I just love podcasts. So I was like eager to continue that. And then when Sheldon was like, hey, we're talking to Ben, I said, yes, let's. And it came together. We figured it out. It's like behind the scenes things. I don't know if people find that interesting or not, but.
Yeah. And piggybacking off that, you asked about how podcasting intersects with my faith, thinking about the discussion that you and I had as we were brainstorming what kind of podcast I might be interested in doing. It felt really important for me to bring in a podcast that could live at the intersections of theology and justice. Those are kind of the intersections that I live at daily, just in my life. I have a political science undergrad, and so very heavily focused on political analysis and societal analysis. And I have one graduate degree as an MDiv, from Christian Theological Seminary. And so it felt important to kind of bring together those different parts of me into something that could be, prophetic, to kind of use the tools that I have at my disposal and to talk about and to analyze what is happening in the world. But more importantly, I believe in storytelling. And I like podcasting as a vehicle to to tell stories, right? And to highlight what is happening in people's lives, because I think it's really easy to look at these big, broad societal issues and to think, oh, that doesn't concern me. It's happening over here, right? This isn't my people. But when you can break it down and tell someone's story, it's a lot harder to dismiss, especially if you're really good at storytelling. And so podcasting is, I think, a great vehicle to do that kind of storytelling that makes the general personal in a way that might motivate transformation and then action.
Right.
Right, Ben, and thanks for sharing that. And also, I mean, it would be interesting to know how you got all your tools, equipment, communication skills. Is that something you learned along the journey, or how did that happen?
Yeah, gradually. So in terms of like the specific tools of podcasting itself, I got really, really blessed working where I work because, we do our own podcast, right? And so I needed a studio set up to be able to co-host the podcast that I co-host. And so then I'm just able to kind of use this for other projects as I might need to, as long as it doesn't interfere with my work. And in terms of the ins and outs of like telling a good story, asking good interview questions, framing a discussion, a lot of that came as I went. I worked for 2 years as an adjunct chaplain at a level 1 trauma center here in Indianapolis. And being a chaplain in a hospital, for those that haven't, is about listening. It's about asking, I don't want to say the right question, but knowing the question to ask that's going to help someone say what they need to say, even if you don't know what they need to say. Just finding a question that is big enough, general enough, but specific enough at the same time to help them let out whatever they need to let out so you can hold that space for them. And so, in terms of kind of interviewing, when I've done interviews for podcasts, a lot of those skills came from chaplaincy or ministry I did when I worked at a church, or just kind of tools that I've picked up as I've been on my own healing journey. As I've spent, as I shared early on in this podcast, I've survived a lot of trauma. I've been homeless, been a victim of domestic violence, seen domestic violence, been in foster care. I've been through a lot. And I've spent a long time healing, or in my healing journey, as I've unpacked the experiences that have shaped me for better or worse sometimes. And so a lot of my worldview, a lot of the ways that I approach podcasting, that I approach storytelling, that a lot of the questions that I ask and the curiosity I bring are things that I picked up from just being dedicated to healing myself. And if you're not curious, it's a lot harder to heal. And so taking that curiosity that I often point inward and finding ways to kind of direct it outward, I think has been a helpful tool, especially as I've gotten more deeper into podcasting.
All right, Ben, thanks so much. And I think that leads us to the next question that we have. We talk a little bit about your background. Now we want to talk about that moment that we decided to make What Would It Take, or that you had that idea. How did it came together between Anabaptist World and Ben? Let's have Dani answer that first. How did your interaction with Ben and Anabaptist World start? How did it all come together?
Yeah, well, I think Ben mentioned this a little bit already about having a conversation with Sheldon, who was the director of the Mennonite, and then I got to join in on the fun of becoming Anabaptist World. And we just had a conversation together. And I was really interested in what would be life-giving for you, Ben. I don't know. I'm so happy that Anabaptist World could be a place for that project to come alive. And I've said grateful already, but yeah, I feel like you've really put a lot of yourself into these episodes and shared a lot with the listeners and with us. And I don't know, thank you for allowing all of us to listen and to learn with you on those journeys.
Dani, and before Ben answers, with Anabaptist World, since we're so new, this is a new brand that we're joining. We joined two publications, two pretty big publications, and we merged it into one, right? So how does What Would It Take come to the mission of this new brand of Anabaptist World, what we want to show to the public, because I think it's it's a very different sort of podcast from other brands. We're bringing in very relevant issues to our context. So how does Anabaptist World embrace this and say, hey, this is a podcast that we wanna help promote, help publish? How does that happen?
Well, I'm going to try to answer that question, Juan, and then you tell me if I didn't do a good job or you want me to do it better. I mean, I think that this is, like I said before, the exact kind of prophetic content that I hope Anabaptist World can continue to partner in and create, because I might get in trouble. I think that's the best of Anabaptism, is when we can be prophetic to the world around us, just different enough to create curiosity and live out Jesus, emulating Jesus in the world. And Anabaptist World is the publication about Anabaptism and for anyone interested in Anabaptism, in our news and our content. And that's a lot of different voices on a spectrum of theology and place and probably what they think is purpose, And so I see this as one way that we're helping to push Ben's voice out into the world and his experience and a theological perspective that many, many people can relate to.
Exactly, and that's what we want to do with Anabaptist World, join stories, have people, if you hear Ben's story but you can relate, even though if you're in another part of the world, I think that's also part of our vision. How do we join these stories? How do we make them come to life? So Ben, the same question to you. How does the idea of What Would It Take podcast come together? How was that moment? When do you decide, hey, I really need to make a podcast about this and these types of issues, and this is a great platform to do it?
I was smiling to myself because I don't really need an excuse to speak publicly about something. You offer me a stage and I'm like, yes, I won't even think twice. So just kind of laughing at myself. But I think the idea for this specific podcast took a little bit of time. I pitched a different idea to Dani altogether up front, and then I sat on it for a couple weeks. We were going to circle back to it 2 weeks later. And as I was preparing for my second meeting with Dani and just kind of chewing on the initial idea, it didn't feel right. I don't think it was a bad idea, but I didn't have the passion that I knew I would need to sustain the project, right? And for me, inspiration and passion are very important, especially when I'm trying to create something. And so I thought to myself, all right, if this isn't it, then what is? What is something that would excite me to do week in and week out? And one of the things that I am passionate about is imagination, right? It's being able to find inspiration in the pain of life, inspiration in the trial and tribulation of life. And so I kind of, the idea just kind of popped up, what would it take? What would it take to create a world that we all want to live in? What would it take to create a world that had fewer societal ills than the one that we currently inhabit? And I think that question is either explicitly or implicitly at the core of most Christian traditions, maybe even most world religion traditions, right? We're kind of inherently responding to this question of what could the world be like and what would it take to get there? And so that's kind of the belief that the idea was born with, and why I think it ties into Christianity broadly, faith broadly, but specifically Anabaptism. Anabaptism as a movement was born almost, I don't want to rewrite history, but kind of in response to a similar question, right? People were experiencing a faith, a lifestyle, societal trends and politics that not only didn't match their lives, but felt oppressive and harmful and were ultimately deadly. And so they broke away and kind of forged ahead with a belief system that felt more authentic to who they were and how they felt the world should look and be. And so, coming out of the Trump presidency, going through a global pandemic, looking at a world that sometimes, to me anyway, feels like it's literally on fire, I think imagination is so crucial. And I think we have to remind people and remind ourselves of two important factors. One, there are these common threads of humanity that bind us together, and we can often access those through stories. And so I think it's important to remember that. And two, we have the capability to imagine almost whatever world we want, right? And if we use the collective skills, the collective tools, the divine imagination and creativity that is within each of us, I really believe that we can alter the course of history and change the trajectory. We just have to be willing to do that. And sometimes we need little reminders of our imaginative and creative potential and capability. And I see this podcast as one very, very, very small nudge in that direction, one minute reminder that we collectively and individually are capable of great things as long as we're willing to put the imagination into play and into action.
Okay, Danny, do you have we're gonna jump into the main part of this season finale, right? So Danny, I think we're gonna talk about some of the episodes.
Yeah, well, Ben, do you mind sharing with us like one or two episodes that you're still thinking about? And then Juan and I will share too.
And this was a podcast that we had 10 episodes in total. You know, the first episode was pretty much the introduction, but for those of you who haven't checked out the podcast, feel free to look at it in Spotify, Stitcher, in any streaming service. What would it take? 10 very great episodes that are very relevant also to the context that we each live in. So yeah, Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate this question. I loved that when we talked about what we would discuss today, that y'all had this idea to bring it up, because it let me revisit some of the content that then re-sparked my own passion and imagination. So I really love this. In the first episode, I will mention might be episode 3. I really don't remember what episode what order these came out in. There we go. Yeah, episode 3. What would it take for our children to be safe? And this one I think is sticking with me. You know, there were some episodes that I did that I kind of knew the general outline. I knew a lot of the statistics. I knew the history. I had a good grasp on the issue. This is one that I kind of knew a broad outline, but the deeper I dug into this epidemic of maternal mortality and infant mortality, especially in Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color in general, it broke my heart more and more. Partly, I think, because I've got an almost 18-month-old son now, and so I'm not that far removed from becoming a father, from seeing my child born, and so I'm close enough to remember, and to think that there are thousands of people, thousands of families each year in the U.S. that experience heartbreak and tragedy and grief when they should be experiencing joy and wonder and excitement, and they should be dreaming about the future together. They have to plan funerals. It breaks my heart, and it breaks my heart even more because it doesn't have to happen. In the society that we live in, these deaths are so preventable. But because of systemic racism, because we're not utilizing and allotting resources and allocating resources effectively and appropriately, because we have our blinders on and we're letting money drive instead of people and relationships, women and children are dying unnecessarily. Funerals are happening unnecessarily, and it's disproportionately impacting Black women and Indigenous women specifically, and Black and Indigenous families specifically. And so, I think for that reason, it just continues to stay with me. And the longer I see my child kind of grow up and reach these developmental milestones, I think in the back of my mind, I'm aware of all the stories and all the people and all the families that don't get to see those same milestones. And it just doesn't have to be that way. And so this episode in particular really sticks with me and kind of gets me worked up, because it's so tragic and so unfortunate. The second episode that is still... did you want to jump in, Juan? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Okay. Share with us the other episode. Thanks.
The second episode, it might be episode 10 or 9, who knows? But it's about homelessness. And so, what would it take for everyone to have a home? And this episode hit me, I think, because almost every single day, I am walking by and interacting with people that are housing insecure or homeless. I work smack dab in the middle of downtown Indianapolis. And so there are quite a few people that are housing insecure and that are homeless. And I live on the east side of Indy. Same thing there. And so every day I'm seeing these people, kind of wondering about their lives, wondering how they got there. I've got my own assumptions that I'm making about their stories, right or wrong. I think we all just kind of naturally assume and make up stories. But again, this is another issue where it doesn't have to be this way. This is an episode that I learned, about housing insecurity and homelessness. I learned the differences, between long-term and short-term housing insecurity and homelessness. I wasn't aware of that before. And I learned about some of the recommended solutions to this issue that I mentioned in the episode and put in the show notes. And so it was one where I learned a lot, and one where, again, I walked away thinking, my God, these solutions seem so obvious. Why are we not doing something about this? And for me, it comes back to, almost always, everything comes back to systemic racism, but also kind of our own, like the way that's married to capitalism. And the way I think it encourages us, especially those of us that grew up in middle class or upper class households, to think about and prioritize our own access to resources, our own security, our own stability, and to look at those that don't have the means we have as threats to our security, to our safety, to our income, to look at them as undeserving, to judge them unnecessarily without knowing their story. And then those judgments influence policy. They influence who we elect. And so you have people getting locked up when they don't need to be locked up. You have people living on the street when we could just, allocate more resources to create permanent housing for them, or pump money into systems that would help provide mental health services or training. I mean, there are a plethora of solutions. There are some cities and states across the country that are beginning to utilize and put these solutions in play, and they're seeing amazing results. Unfortunately, it's not happening in most of the country, and I think it's due to a lack of awareness, and it's due to an inability to be curious, an inability to examine our own privilege and the way that it influences our mindsets and our perceptions, and how those then influence our actions and the way we vote and the policy choices that we make. Because again, these people don't have to suffer the way that they're suffering. We have enough resources. We have the imagination. We have models of what to do to help decrease the number of people that are housing insecure and homeless, both long-term and short-term. It's just a matter of getting the information out there and being willing to put in the work to ensure that those policies are put into place.
Okay, awesome.
So, okay, those are mine. Danny, Juan, I'd love to hear from you. What was ones that are sticking with you?
Yeah. Danny, would you mind sharing with us what episode stood up for you this first season of the What Would It Take podcast?
Yeah. Well, I've said this to you guys, and I'll say this to people who are watching. I could have picked any of them, really, truly. But I think the one that I picked for today was episode 7, I think, which is where you break down different ideas and theologies around hell and heaven, right? Like that's a 2-for-1er. And then you introduce the audience to what liberation theology has to like inform and offer to that conversation. And you make the connection that what any of us believe about the afterlife or heaven and hell has direct implications to how we live out our faith in the here and now. And you talk about Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, which is a play. If you haven't listened to that episode, Ben explains that a little bit. And like, I was taken to that play when I was a child, and it did its job. It scared me. And so I don't remember where it was or when it was, but whenever, I don't know, it solidified to me, like when we pray on earth as it is in heaven, that can be a mandate just as much as like a wishful plea. That was really freeing for me. And so I'm just still thinking, I think I see that playing out in my own life and like in people's lives that I love, how it can, I don't know, contain you to this role of judge, or it can free you to better reflect Jesus's love to other people. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but that's what it brought up for me. Maybe I can say that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting to define what is hell, right? And we have this misconception of fire, of flames, of everything, but then we forget so many things that happen today that really resemble death. All these images that we have of hell, some of those are brought to this earth, and we also need to learn, I think, to distinguish, what's good, what's evil in this world. How do we come to our own conclusions based on our faith, based on our teachings. So yeah, I think it's very important that Ben brought it up in this episode, and made us reflect truly. What if hell is closer than we think? What if it's right here? Rather than we always think of heaven, hell, very the top, the bottom, but really there's so many things going on in the world today that it feels like we need, again, the prophetic voice to determine, hey, this is evil, this is wrong, right? We need to work to change that. What does it take to change the current situations that we live in? So yeah, I think also that episode is very important. And for me, sorry guys, I don't know if Ben wanted to say anything about this particular
Ben, did you want to say
episode.
anything?
Yeah, just noting, I loved how you talked about that mandate in the Lord's Prayer. Like kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And I'd never thought about it in that language before. Not as a wish, not as a hope, but as a mandate. As a commitment. As disciples, like, no, we are going to work to ensure that your will is done here and now, and that will has to extend beyond eternal salvation. It has to extend beyond this idea of the pearly gates or the orange flames, right? What does it mean today, right, for the will of the divine to be done? What does it mean in downtown Indianapolis, or on the east side of Indy, or in Colombia, or in Israel and Palestine, or anywhere? What does it mean for God's will to be done? What does it mean to see creation whole in the flesh today? And so, yeah, that took me to a place, and I just appreciate that reframing.
Awesome. Yeah, for me, the episode that stood up for me was episode 8. What would it take to truly love our neighbors? Ben, you talked about some examples of immigrant families, right? U.S.-Mexico border. And I think it's such a relevant issue because I'm here in Colombia. Our neighbors are ones that I can speak directly to. It's people from Venezuela, and it seems like there's always the same sort of issue. There's always racism against our neighbors, right? Lack of opportunities, discrimination. So it really happens everywhere. It really happens everywhere. And and I thought it was important that in this episode we talked on how do we get into someone else's shoes. Let's get their perspective. What does it mean to leave your family behind, to get out of your country by force, by the lack of opportunities or by violence or whatnot. But I think it's a misconception that we have all over the world, that people just coming to the country to take the jobs, to steal our economy, to do wrong. But it's not, for most of the people, that's not the case. When people cross the border, when they decide to leave, there's a long journey, there's deserts, there's dangers, there's real dangers, there's families that are separated from one another. There's laws also that come into play that where some of these family members don't get to see each other for years because they're held in detention centers. So I thought this episode really stood up for me because I've been an immigrant. I've been in other countries. I know what it feels like. I've had friends who don't have papers, but they're in a country working, making their living. And I think it's always good to put ourselves in each other's shoes, in each other's in the perspective of another. See the suffering and also learn. If we're suffering discrimination, right? If I suffer discrimination somewhere else, I don't want that to be done to me. So why should we do it? So yeah, I think that was a pretty good episode and one that stood out for me. I don't know if Ben, you have anything else to add about that episode.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you brought that episode out, Juan, because for me, it was one of the episodes that I think was most driven by a story. Not only the story of the father that came with his young daughter. That was traumatic. But in the back of my mind, there's the story of a woman named Erica, whose last name I forget. But she, I think I mentioned it in the podcast episode, she came here when she was 5. Her parents brought her here, I believe, from Mexico. Lived in Beach Grove, which is a small city within the city of Indianapolis. We're weird over here. And they had a family. They were like actively involved in their local church. And her husband one day got pulled over because he supposedly had a taillight out. Gets pulled over. They realize he doesn't have papers, and so they arrest him and put him in a detention center, right, for months. So now she's suddenly without her husband, without his income. And on top of that, they then come to her home and try to force her out of her house to forcibly kind of detain her. She's able to avoid that, but then she has to report every week or something for these hearings. And every hearing she knows she could go in and then be like arrested and put in a van and put in a detention center, right? And then what's she going to do to her kids? And so I got connected with Faith in Indiana, which is a faith-based organizing group here. It's part of Faith in Action, which is a nationwide network. And I started going to some of these check-in appointments as a part of a team that went to support her. And I already had my political views set about this, but to see her, to hear her story, to see her tears, to see the anxiety that she felt, to see her daughter with her at these check-ins, like, again, the power of a story, the power of seeing a human being go through this process that I had already read about. I don't know how it can't grip you. Like, I don't know how you could experience that and see that and hear her story and not be moved and enraged. And so that experience kind of planted the seed in me for this idea, and it was in the back of my mind the entire time I was recording the episode, because again, it could have been avoided. She ended up voluntarily going back to Mexico with her children so that she wouldn't randomly be deported, right? If she decided to leave, at least she had some control over when and how. But to be torn away from her community needlessly makes no sense to me, and that it is unjust, plain and simple. So anyway, another diatribe, but that story had gripped me the entire time I was recording. So yeah, thanks for letting me share that one.
All right, awesome. I think we're jumping into the end of this live stream. Thank you all for the people who got connected, and once again we're sharing the season finale of the What Would It Take podcast here from Anabaptist World. With the special host Ben Tapper here preaching to all of us. So yeah, what are you guys' hopes for season 2? When is season 2 coming on? Dani, Ben, what are the hopes? What are we planning to touch on? What topics? What ideas do you guys have?
Yeah. Well, Ben, I'll let you say what your hopes and ideas are. I'll just say, like, we're working on, like, we want to have a season 2, but we don't have a set date yet. So stay tuned. Later this year, it'll happen. But life is crazy, so it'll come when it comes.
Yes, it is indeed.
Yeah.
So, hopefully we'll be able to get it launched early fall at some point. Mm-hmm. In terms of like what I think would be reasonable to expect from it, I want to continue this focus on stories. And so I want to kind of redouble my efforts on making this a narrative-driven podcast, number one. I want to keep it bite-sized so that you can kind of listen to it and digest it and then dive deeper when you want to. And I think we might incorporate an interview or two just for different content, so you can have different voices periodically. We might get real funky and do a audio and visual podcast episode at some point in season 2, just to keep playing with things. And then I think there are a variety of topics that can be explored, some of which I wanted to get to in season 1, but just wasn't able to. Like, oh man! So as I think about what the topics might be, I can already like hear the protests that are gonna come from some people, because some of these topics just make folks really uncomfortable, but they're really important to talk about, right? So talking about how harmful abstinence-only sex education is for teens and adults, talking about what's going on in Israel and Palestine, right? And discussing that in the context of apartheid. Talking about mass incarceration and doing a deeper dive into what that is and what that isn't. And then another random idea was just the importance of narrative in general. I read an article the other day that a friend sent me that was a profile on the English Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And in that profile, they compared him to Donald Trump. And as I was reading it, a theme kept coming up about the importance of narrative. And so thinking about the ways that Boris has used narrative in the UK, the way that Trump used narrative here, like the MAGA movement and what that tapped into. And so just kind of elaborating on how we use narrative for political movements, and how we can think more strategically about utilizing that. So all those are potential topics. And then I personally would love to hear what people that regularly listen want to explore, want to know more about, want to do a deeper dive into. And so as you have a chance, you can reach out to me directly, reach out to Anabaptist World. I'd love to get some topic ideas from y'all just to see what you're interested in hearing about and learning about in this upcoming season.
Right, and I think you touch on like stories. They're so important to that's how we know the world, through stories, right? That's our perception of the world. And I think it would be also important to expand a little bit more, maybe on season 2. Like you mentioned, other countries. I think it would be definitely interesting and also part of the journey and the mission that we have, to connect the world. Because I feel like a lot of these stories are similar, but in different contexts, right? There's people who suffer injustice, discrimination, homelessness, challenges to their faith, wars. So I don't think that we should prive ourselves from listening those stories outside of our continent, and I think it's also a great opportunity just to reach out to broader audiences, Ben. For example, what you mentioned in Palestine, important to talk about that. What's happening now in Colombia. We've been almost more than a month in a national strike, due to all these economic injustices. So yeah, it's very important to hear so many voices, that need to be heard. So I think this is a great space.
I think that is very well said, Juan. I appreciate you bringing that up. And in addition to the kind of that expanding perspective, another way that I think about using this podcast to expand perspective is bringing in more intentional analysis of theology, more intentional analysis of specifically biblical interpretation, right? This is the Anabaptist podcast. Many of those that are listening are going to be in Anabaptist, maybe even Mennonite congregations week in and week out. And so I think it's important to continue to frame it both politically and theologically so that we understand the why, right? So that we have these theological narratives in our back pocket and can frame then our course of action. I think there are certain theological narratives and viewpoints that are rampant in our society and are really easy to grab onto and to use. But I think it's really important to kind of expand that imagination like we did with liberation theology, and to help people know that there are other options. There are other ways of thinking about what and who and how God is than maybe what the narrative that we were given growing up. Shannon Dykes with the deep questions and wonderings. Should have expected. Since you asked, Shannon, that request will be granted. I will do that wrestling with the prevalence of binaries in conversations. So we can go there.
All right, awesome. I don't know, Danny, sorry, do you have anything to add?
Not really. I mean, I think like talking about purity culture to Mennonites is like we are gonna hear some things, but it's so relevant, and yeah, I'm excited for season 2.
Uh,
I think.
uh,
Oh, what?
yeah, sorry, I was just gonna say, and some of these topics are they make us uncomfortable. You know,
Right.
like I remember when we were trying to edit all the audios down and getting the topics and everything, we really had to sit down and say, okay, what tone can we use to share the same information, you know, the same
Right.
information, but we want to reach, we want to have a broader reach. So how do we share this information? You know, being using certain type of language where it's not passive, but it also it calls for change. You know, because that's what we need. So I think Danny and Ben, I think we pulled it off in a way that it was very welcoming, you know, without leaving the prophetic voice that also needs to be heard.
And I got to shout out Danny, especially for that reminder and that push to bring more of that pastoral voice, and then also again bringing Shannon up again. She's someone that I learned under, and I think does this well. Because I mean, I'll just be honest, y'all. My initial bent is just to name a thing, call a spade, and then to keep it moving. If you got a problem with it, that's really not on me, is it? So it's important to have these people in my life that can check me, that can offer reminders that, yeah, you've got more than just kind of that harsh tone in you. How might you package this in a way that is palatable and helpful, rather than alienating? Sometimes you got to alienate people, but not every time you speak. And so it's helpful to have those reminders.
I think, Ben, you've done an awesome job of like holding pastoral and prophetic, and like I don't know, those are like the way that you've done it has been wonderful. And other people in my life too, those are my teachers, right? Like when you can hold those two together, you challenge and you bring people along. And I hope that's what we've created together. I think we have.
Right, and this is just the first season. So if you guys are listening, wait for the next season. I'm sure it's gonna be very exciting to share new stories, new perspectives. All right, so we're reaching the end. Once again, thank you to the people who are connected, listening. We answer a couple of those questions that were on the comment. But if you have more questions, feel free to reach us through inbox, either here in Anabaptist World or maybe with Ben also, right? How can we find you in social media, Ben?
Yeah, you would ask me that. I never remember my social media tags. However, on Facebook, you can find me as Benjamin J. Tapper. On Instagram, I think I am Mr. Tapper or Mr. Tapper. And then a similar handle on Snapchat. You can also email me at bjtapper@gmail.com. And I think that email address, or one of my email addresses anyway, is in the show notes of the podcast. So you can find me. And if you can't find me, reach out to Danny or Juan. They'll know how to get a hold of me as well.
You can pass along those messages for sure. Hey,
All right.
Before we hop off, Ben, are there like any plugs you want to give to other resources right now? There's a few I do, but I'll let you go first.
Yeah, there's one in particular that I want to mention, and that is the police, I believe it's the police abolition curriculum called Defund the Police ? Or something like that, that MCUSA just launched. I was part of the dope team that helped create and imagine and envision that work, and so I just encourage y'all to check that out if you're wondering, especially in the fall, what kind of adult Sunday school topics you can explore. If you are a pastor who has heard about, defund the police, heard about police abolition, and just curious about how it may or may not tie into Anabaptist values or the gospel, check it out. And even if you come into it, I'm not expecting you to come into it and just kind of go through the whole 9-10 week program and walk away as a police abolitionist. However, I think if you're open enough, you'll learn a lot of things. You will question the ways in which you approach and look at different elements of society, like our schools, our education systems, our homeless population. And more than anything, I think you will hold the question of what does it mean to be safe? And what does it mean for different groups and types of people to be safe? And how do we create a society in which that goal is actually lived out day in and day out? And so I would just encourage you to check out that resource. The people that worked on it are amazing. Any of them individually can school me on the topic. And so I was just grateful to be part of that team and to learn from them. And so I just think you should check out that resource when you get a chance.
Yeah, and we can add the link in the comments section too for that. And kind of to piggyback off of that, Laboring Towards Wholeness is another new curriculum out of MCUSA. And I don't know, like all of the women who participated in writing that are amazing. Not to like compete in the fall for your Sunday school curriculum, but that is another great one that I hope lots of people will hold on to. And everyone, there's going to be a new podcast on Anabaptist World, and it's going to be about dismantling the doctrine of discovery, and hosts are Sarah Augustine and Sherry Hostetler. And if you go to our website right now, you can find it. We have our first intro episode. I'm so excited. They're two amazing women. If you're not familiar with their work, they're co-founders of the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition. And we talk about all the isms, and it's really great. So if you've enjoyed Ben's podcast, I think you'll also enjoy this other one as well.
All right. Awesome. Ben, Dani, thank you all for joining us. The people who are tuning in at this moment from different parts of the world. We're very happy to end this season. And people can also go back to the other episodes in our website, on Spotify and Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you have streaming platforms. We have the episodes there for you to check out. Once again, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Dani, for joining us today in the season finale of the Why Would It Take podcast.
Yeah, thank you both. Great to be here.
All right, guys, stay tuned for more, and we'll put the links with some helpful resources in the comments below. All right, have a good evening, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.